the desperate Duchess of Delusion went for the Amazon boss Jeff Bezos. And of course, it's for professional reasons, you know.
How are you?
Most richest man in the country, and wants him to help her become a billionaire herself, which you could easily.
The message didn't go unanswered. That detail matters. It was read, it was logged, and then it was escalated. Inside Jeff Bezos' world, that sequence only happens when something crosses from routine outreach into potential risk. High-profile requests arrive constantly. Introductions, proposals, quiet feelers framed as opportunities. Most are handled calmly and filtered through standard channels. This one was different. According to people familiar with how Bezos' senior team operates, the issue was not the sender. It was the assumption embedded in the message. A midnight ask is never just about timing. It's about bypassing friction. It signals urgency, discretion, and an expectation that normal review can be skipped. And that's where everything tilted. Midnight messages aren't accidental. They're strategic. They whisper urgency. They hint at exclusivity. They say, handle this quietly. Now, in some circles, that kind of confidence works. It opens doors, it creates shortcuts. But Bezos' ecosystem doesn't run on shortcuts. It runs on insulation.
But these parties, you do not sign it. You're a VIP. If you've got to make people sign documents, you don't get into Jeff Bezos' house. This was someone's home. It was a very, very private place. It just was ridiculous. Oprah didn't sign a document. Beyonce didn't sign a document.
In some circles, that works. In Bezos' ecosystem, it does not. His team is trained to treat late-night high-confidence outreach as a red flag. Not because it's hostile, but because it often indicates an attempt to create leverage before proper evaluation can occur. That's exactly how this message was interpreted. The wording wasn't aggressive, it wasn't threatening. It was framed as if alignment already existed, as if the request was merely a formality before action. That framing changed everything. Because once a request assumes alignment that hasn't been earned, it stops being a conversation and starts becoming a risk. The tone wasn't rude, it wasn't demanding, it was worse than that. It was presumptive. And inside power structures, presumption triggers defenses faster than aggression ever could. Suddenly, this wasn't about responding politely, it was about what responding would enable later.
British accent?
We all had a great day, I think.
I'm sure we did.
The sun was shining for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, very lucky all around. Today almost, yes.
Yeah.
In an extravagant ceremony in Venice, Italy, June 27th, cap off the weekend of wedding festivities with a PJ-themed bash for their guests.
Responding would validate the assumption. Once that conclusion was reached, the path forward narrowed fast. Bezos' team does not debate when containment is the safer option. They isolate, they document, and they remove the possibility of repetition. Within hours, the outreach was categorized as inappropriate escalation. Not because of tone, but because of process. And that's when people misunderstand what really happened. This wasn't anger, this wasn't offense, this wasn't personal, it was mechanical, cold, procedural. The kind of decision that doesn't come with emotions attached. The moment the team believed a boundary had been tested, the outcome was sealed.
No, Jeff Bezos is Amazon. He's connected to Amazon. And who has recently done a little, who's apparently done a little cameo.
What happened next was not reaction, it was containment. Inside Bezos' organization, there is a standing rule that overrides everything else. Never reward boundary testing with engagement. The moment that rule is triggered, the response becomes automatic. Automatic. That word matters. No debate, no warning, no second chance to reframe. Because once a system like this decides a line has been tested, it doesn't explain. It removes access. And here's the part that stings the most. No one one was angry. No one felt insulted. This wasn't humiliation. It was math. A cost-benefit calculation. Engage and normalize access. Disengage and eliminate exposure. They chose elimination. The block wasn't framed as blocking a person, it was framed as closing a channel. That distinction is brutal because channels are power. And once a channel is identified as risky, it doesn't get cautioned. It gets erased. What followed wasn't drama, it was silence. And silence at this level isn't passive. It's instructional. It teaches you without speaking. It says, this route no longer exists. From the outside, it looks abrupt, confusing, even cruel. From the inside, it looks overdue. Once the channel closed, the team didn't relax. They widened the lens. Who else could be contacted? Which adjacent pathways might still exist? Could the block be bypassed indirectly? Every possible workaround was quietly sealed. Because powerful systems don't wait for pressure to return, they suffocate it preemptively. That's where the backfire deepened. Because now it wasn't just about one message. It was about pattern recognition. And once a pattern is identified, every future attempt gets filtered through that same cold lens. Warnings weren't issued. Explanations weren't offered. Because warnings invite negotiation. Silence ends it. And silence here wasn't emptiness. It was distance. Structural distance. The kind that doesn't shrink with persistence. It expands. By trying to move fast and quietly, the ask triggered the slowest response imaginable. Time, delay, process, friction. Everything the original message was designed to avoid suddenly became unavoidable. Inside Bezos's operation, normalization set in quickly. Once a channel is closed, the system behaves as if it never existed. No lingering curiosity, no revisiting, no second guessing. That's intentional because curiosity is influence's last doorway, and that doorway slammed shut. The irony is brutal. By attempting to accelerate access, the Midnight Ask permanently decelerated it. Any future engagement, if it ever happened, would now require visibility, intermediaries, legal review, and time. Endless time. That's when the situation stopped being an incident and became a condition. And once something becomes a condition inside a system like this, it's over. What most people never understand is that the real damage didn't happen at the moment of the block. It happened after. Because inside systems like this, a block is not the end of the process. It's the beginning of stabilization. That's when the machinery really starts moving quietly, methodically, without spectacle. Once the channel was shut, the internal question shifted instantly. Not what just happened, but what could happen next. That's where many high-profile figures miscalculate. They assume silence means reconsideration. In reality, silence means the system is already redesigning itself to make sure the situation never resurfaces. Inside Bezos's world, containment symmetry matters. If one door closes, every nearby door gets checked. Who else might be contacted? Which assistants? Which advisors? Which informal overlaps might exist? Not because anyone expected chaos, but because powerful systems never wait for pressure to test them twice. Every edge was sealed before a second move could even be imagined. And here's the part that feels cruel but isn't. The block wasn't meant to send a message. It wasn't punishment, it wasn't retaliation, it was insulation. The goal wasn't to humiliate, it was to make sure urgency could never land again. Urgency is dangerous currency. Midnight Asks thrive on it. They compress time, shrink scrutiny, and create the illusion that something must be handled now. Bezos' team understands that illusion better than most. So the first thing they remove is speed. And once speed disappears, influence collapses. From that moment forward, any outreach carrying even a hint of the same pressure signature would encounter the same outcome. Delay, review, visibility, friction, not rejection, worse than that, irrelevance. Messages don't bounce back, they simply stop moving. That's institutional distance at work. Inside the system, this didn't feel dramatic. There were no heated conversations, no moral judgments, no gossip. It felt resolved almost immediately. Because alignment with doctrine matters more than emotion. And the doctrine is simple. Never reward boundary testing with engagement. That principle hardened everything. What many people don't realize is that pattern recognition doesn't reset just because tone improves later. Once a method is identified as risky, future attempts aren't judged on content alone. They're judged on resemblance. Similar timing, similar framing, similar urgency, similar discretion cues. Even perfectly reasonable requests can drown under that shadow. That's the irreversible part. The original message didn't just fail, it taught the system something about how it was being approached. And once a system learns, it doesn't unlearn. It encodes, it automates, it stops needing attention. That's why there was no warning, no explanation, no try again this way. Because offering an alternative implies legitimacy. It implies the request was acceptable but misrouted. The internal conclusion was harsher. The approach itself had disqualified future engagement. Distance became policy. At this stage, influence strategies usually implode. They depend on feedback, on friction that can be adjusted against, on signals that say almost. But here, there were no signals, just absence. And absence drives influence faster than confrontation ever could. Inside Bezos's operation, the incident faded from active memory quickly. That wasn't accidental. Active memory invites reconsideration. Procedural memory enforces reflex. So the situation stopped being discussed. No postmortems, no cautionary emails naming names. It was absorbed and forgotten on the surface. But underneath, it was locked in a process. That's how powerful systems avoid myth-making. The moment something becomes a story internally, it gains symbolic weight. Bezos's team treats incidents as inputs, not narratives. Once absorbed, they disappear. That disappearance is final. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. No public fallout, no dramatic refusal, no leaked response. But internally, the environment had shifted. Timelines stretched. Familiarity evaporated. Curiosity vanished. That's when access truly dies. Because access isn't revoked loudly. It's deprioritized until it no longer exists. Requests don't get denied. They lose momentum. They drift. They stall. They wait forever. And that waiting is intentional. By this stage, even indirect attempts would fail automatically. New intermediaries would encounter the same delays. New framings would hit the same friction. Not because anyone remembered the midnight ask consciously, but because the system had been redesigned to neutralize that style of approach. That's the genius of it. No one needs to enforce the boundary anymore. The environment does it on its own. This is where most people finally sense something is wrong. Doors that once felt open feel heavy. Conversations stall, nothing escalates, nothing resolves. It's not rejection. It's disengagement. And disengagement is permanent. A refusal can be revisited, disengagement can not. By trying to compress time and bypass structure, the original ask created the opposite outcome. Time expanded, structure hardened, access slowed to a crawl, influence suffocated under its own urgency. At this point, there was no escalation coming, no clarification, no reset. Apologies wouldn't matter. Better wording wouldn't help. The environment had settled into its final state. That's the part people struggle to accept. They expect power to announce itself, to explain, to justify, to defend. But powerful private systems don't do that. They redesign the environment so the problem never returns. The block was never the point. The loss of access was. And once access disappears at this level, it doesn't come back quietly, if it comes back at all. The midnight ask didn't end with drama. It ended with irrelevance. And irrelevance is the cleanest ending power structures aim for. No conflict, no headlines, just a hardened system and a closed channel that no longer needs guarding. That's what happens when a line is crossed that the system doesn't forgive. The message didn't just go too far. It changed the rules of engagement forever. And that final consequence is the one nobody ever sees coming. Because when powerful systems reach indifference, they don't feel victorious. They feel finished. There's no satisfaction, no lingering emotion, no sense of conflict resolved. The situation simply drops out of relevance. And once relevance is gone, nothing else matters. What replaces it is routine. Messages get routed. Timelines stretch. Priorities reorder themselves automatically. The system no longer reacts because there is nothing left to react to. That's when you know influence has fully collapsed. Not when someone says no, but when no one feels the need to say anything at all. At this level, silence isn't avoidance. It's closure. The kind of closure that doesn't announce itself, doesn't justify itself, and doesn't invite interpretation. It just exists. And once it exists long enough, even the sender stops pushing, because pushing produces nothing. No resistance, no engagement, just time. That's the quiet brutality of it. The Midnight Ask didn't provoke backlash, it provoked disappearance. And disappearance is the one outcome that can't be spun, reframed, or recovered from quickly. Because in the end, power doesn't slam doors, it redesigns the building so the door is no longer there. Door is no longer there. Door is no longer there. Door is no longer